Long before the Kaminoans grew the army that would change the entire galaxy, they were just a people trying not to drown. Their whole story starts with water and a world that turned against the very species living on it. Kamino sits in a part of the galaxy called Wild Space, far south of the Outer Rim territories. It rests near the Rishi Maze, which is a small satellite galaxy slowly drifting in a decaying orbit. Because Kamino sits so far out beyond the main disk of the galaxy, some people even consider it to be extragalactic. That is how removed this place is from everything else. The planet is the fifth world in a system of 13 planets, all orbiting an old and aging star. Kamino has 3 moons of its own. Underneath everything sits a molten core, a rocky mantle, and a crust made of silicate. But you would never see any of that. All of it is buried beneath an ocean that covers almost the entire world. The only land left is a small handful of islands, and those islands were once the tops of mountains. The clone troopers who would later be born here had their own names for the place. They called it Big Stormy. They also called it the Planet of Storms, and those names were well earned. The surface of Kamino is hit by near constant rain, savage winds, and bursts of lightning that flicker through a thick and churning atmosphere. The weather here almost never settles down. But here is the part that most people do not know. The Kaminoans were not always an ocean people. Way back in their distant past, they lived mostly on land. Their survival was always tied to the seas around them, but they had solid ground beneath their feet. That ground would not last forever. Around 19,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the climate on Kamino started to shift in a dramatic way. The huge glaciers that had covered the planet began to melt. This brought a long planetary ice age to a sudden and violent close, and there was no turning it back. All of that melting ice had to go somewhere. The water rose, and it kept on rising. The Kaminoans remember this event as the Great Flood. The waters climbed over the continents, swallowed the land masses, and came very close to ending the entire species. Their natural terrain could not hold the seas back. There was nothing left to stop the water. So the early Kaminoans did the only thing they could. They abandoned the low ground and they started building higher. As the water climbed, they climbed right along with it. This became a desperate struggle that stretched across many generations, with each one racing the rising sea upward. Their buildings changed along with their situation. They started with simple homes made of mud and woven branches. Then they moved to houses raised up on stilts on higher ground. And finally, they built towering stone spires designed to stand above the waves. Step by step, their architecture grew taller and far stronger. Eventually, the Kaminoans built sturdy cities that were fully sealed off from the outside. These structures could stand up to the giant waves and the relentless storms that battered the planet. And they were built to hold everything at once, sheltering the people, the farming, and the animals all under one roof. Now this is the moment that would define the Kaminoans forever. They had lost their dry land. They could have reached out to the rest of the galaxy and asked for rescue. Instead, they decided it was less of a gamble to rebuild their own world and reshape their own bodies to match it. They chose to solve the problem themselves. That single choice set everything in motion. It started the Kaminoans down the road of mastering genetics and bioengineering. It also planted the seed of the deep isolation that would mark their culture for the next 19,000 years. They turned inward, and they stayed that way for a very long time. To survive on a flooded world, the Kaminoans put their growing genetic skill to work. They took plants and animals that had once lived on land, and they carefully adapted them to live in the new water-covered and storm-beaten environment. They were already learning how to bend life itself to fit their needs. The memory of the sea and its power lived on in their legends too. One old story told of a god-beast named Protoss, who was said to rule over all the oceans before the second sun ever rose. Protoss was challenged first by a titan called Melkor, and then by a legion known as Kikla. After winning those battles, Protoss grew arrogant. He blocked a pod of Aiwaz from migrating to warmer waters, and the cold was too much for them to handle. So the Aiwaz fought back, and they won only because one of their own gave itself up to save the rest. The lesson of that story valued cleverness and sacrifice over raw strength. Even after their civilization climbed back up and thrived again, the Kaminoans stayed scientific and rational. Still, they made solemn journeys down to the sunken ruins of their old drowned cities, honoring the catastrophe that had shaped them into who they were. The species that came out of the Great Flood was inward-looking and obsessed with control. They had watched their own world turn against them once, and they made a quiet promise to themselves that they would never again be left at the mercy of chance. Their location helped keep them hidden. Sitting far out in wild space, surrounded by endless storms and a difficult approach, meant that for ages only a small number of beings anywhere even knew that Kamino existed. Some sources say the Galactic Republic did not become aware of Kamino until around 4,500 years before the Battle of Yavin. That shows just how long these people developed completely on their own. Over time, the Kaminoans spread their cities across the warm waters near the equator. The grandest of them all was Tipoca City, a sprawling network of domed towers standing on stilts high above the surf, held up by pillars driven deep into the seabed. The endless fight against their environment gave Kaminoan culture one defining value above all others. It was the relentless pursuit of perfection, and that obsession would one day turn them into the finest cloners in the galaxy. From the moment their continents went under, they saw their survival as an act of will and engineering. That worldview would go on to shape their politics, their science, and the chilling coldness they became known for. And there is one more piece to all of this. The very isolation that nearly finished the Kaminoans would later become their greatest strategic asset. That same remoteness made their planet the perfect place to hide a secret army. Everything the galaxy would come to rely on and fear about these people. Their mastery of genetics, their secrecy, their coldness, and their cities on stilts was born in the rising waters of the Great Flood. The drowned world set the stage, and the species that climbed out of it would go on to build the soldiers who fought the Clone Wars and brought down the 1,000-generation Jedi Order. The Flood took their land, but it handed the Kaminoans something else in return. It gave them a choice about what kind of species they wanted to become, and the answer they settled on would unsettle the rest of the galaxy for thousands of years. When the seas rose, countless numbers of them were lost. The ones who pulled through did not get there gently. They made it because they were willing to think the unthinkable. They looked at their own bodies and their own family line and decided that nothing was off limits. If a trait made them weak, it could be trimmed away. If a trait made them stronger, it could be kept and spread to the next generation. There was no room for softness in any of it. They would no longer be the victims of their own world. They had decided to become the masters of their own genome instead. This was the start of something that came to define them completely. Through careful breeding, through genetics, and through cloning, the Kaminoans pulled themselves out of starvation and overcrowding by rewriting their own biology. They did not treat this as some grim emergency measure. To them, editing the genetic code of their own people was both an everyday task and a form of high art, the same way a painter approaches a fresh canvas. So what did these people actually look like? The ones who reshaped themselves on purpose. Kaminoans are tall and slender, usually standing well over 6.5 feet high. They have long and graceful necks, stretched out limbs, and surprisingly small heads. Their skin is pale and smooth, with a soft glow to it that brings to mind the shimmering inside of a seashell. You can still read their watery past in their bodies. Their long frames were built for swimming. Their legs bend in a way that was once suited for pushing off firm seabeds, and their feet stayed small. Their eyes are large, glassy, and shaped like almonds, made to gather what little light reaches the bottom of a murky sea. And those eyes do something that human eyes cannot. They can see into the ultraviolet range. Because of that, the Kaminoan buildings that look stark and plain white to us are actually washed in rich colors that most other species will never get to enjoy. There are differences between the males and the females as well. Male Kaminoans grow fin-shaped crests and ridges along the back of their skulls. The females are completely bald, and they often wear sculpted crescents on their heads instead. Many of the higher-ranking Kaminoans also wear a tall, pale collar that wraps around the neck. Watching one of them move is a strange experience. Their long limbs and necks give them a slow and gliding walk that almost looks weightless, like they are drifting more than stepping. But that delicate look is a bit of a trick. Underneath it sits a dense and powerful set of muscles built up over generations to handle seas that the storms above churned into chaos. They also grow up remarkably fast. A Kaminoan reaches full adulthood at around 11 years old. They stay in their physical prime until about the age of 40, and they do not really start showing their age until around 80. From there, most of them live to roughly 100 years, but that lifespan was only the baseline, and the Kaminoans had a habit of pushing far past their own baselines. Their command over their genome was so total that certain specially engineered members of the species could be built to live much longer than that. One of them was a Kaminoan named Kina. She was altered so that her body could handle very long hyperspace voyages, and she reportedly lived for more than 3,000 years. Kina matters for another reason too. She was sensitive to the Force, and she trained as a Jedi. For a long time, the belief across the galaxy was that no Kaminoan could ever touch the Force at all. She quietly proved that idea wrong. The old assumption was later blamed on Kaminoan pride, on their habit of experimenting so heavily on their own kind that they may have edited certain gifts right out of themselves without ever realizing what they had lost. Now here is where their story turns colder. Older accounts describe a strict caste system among the Kaminoans, and it was written right into the color of their eyes. The gray-eyed Kaminoans sat at the top as the ruling administrators. The yellow-eyed castes handled the skilled work. The blue-eyed castes were left with the manual labor. Everyone had a fixed place in the order, and a single glance at their eyes gave that place away. Then there were the green-eyed Kaminoans, and what happened to them shows you exactly what this society valued. A green-eyed birth was treated as a flaw, a sign of something inferior, and a threat to their carefully ordered world. Those individuals were often removed shortly after they were born. To the Kaminoans, this was not cruelty. In their minds, it was maintenance. For all of that calculation, they are not a people who show much on the surface. Most Kaminoans carry a calm and unreadable expression, giving away almost nothing of what goes on inside them. There is one rare exception to that stillness. It is a ceremonial dance called the Nahra, and through it they let out the feelings they spend the rest of their lives holding back. They are perfectionists, and they take it to an extreme that borders on intolerance. Their tastes in design are clean and stripped down to the essentials. They are genuinely proud of what their science has achieved, and yet they spend almost no energy worrying about the ethics of their work or about what becomes of the beings they bring into the world. Their view of other species followed that same cold logic. A people working hard to better themselves earned a Kaminoan's respect. A people content to stay exactly as they were struck them as plainly lesser. Some accounts soften this a little, suggesting the Kaminoans mostly saw the rest of the galaxy as a distraction from their own projects. This next part is what truly unsettles outsiders. To a Kaminoan, designing a brand new genome and then selling it carries no more weight than weaving a length of cloth or composing a piece of music. In their minds, it is no different from writing a book and selling copies of it to anyone who wants one. The moral question that would stop most people cold does not register for them at all. After so many generations of cloning and breeding themselves, the Kaminoans had erased the line between what was natural and what was designed. Their present form is, at least in part, something they shaped on purpose. These people are partly their own invention. Their reach over life stretched well beyond their own bodies. They rode great winged sea creatures called Aiwas, gliding across the oceans and the skies and slipping below the waves before resurfacing near wherever they were headed, even while the harshest electrical storms cracked around them. To the Kaminoans, the weather, the seas, and the living creatures of their world were all things to be studied, adapted, and bent toward their own survival. Even nature itself was just one more system waiting to be brought under control. The hardships that came after the flood left deep and lasting marks on who they are. It gave them a calculating survival instinct, a fixation on purity and order, and a real distrust of ever leaning on help from the outside. These were not passing moods that faded with time. They became the very bones of the entire culture. And here sits the strange contradiction at the center of these people. The Kaminoans are capable of real scientific elegance and honest artistry, and at the very same time their worldview made room for trimming away life and discarding it without a second thought. Beauty and coldness lived side by side inside them, and neither one ever seemed to bother the other. Everything that would later make the clone troopers possible grew straight out of this mindset. The engineered obedience, the speeding up of how fast the soldiers aged, the willingness to treat living troopers as property to be bought and spent, all of it traces back to this single philosophy. To understand the Kaminoans, you have to understand that to them, life was raw material and nothing more. The very conviction that carried them through the flood would, generations later, make them perfectly comfortable building millions of soldiers meant to fight and to be used up in a war that was not even their own. The Kaminoans had saved themselves with genetics, and then they did something clever with that skill. They took the very thing that had kept them alive and turned it into the thing they were known for across the stars. Cloning was no longer just a survival tool for these people. It became the entire point of their civilization. They built living organisms to order, copying and reshaping life at a level that no other species in the galaxy could come close to matching. This was their craft, and they were the finest alive at it. For a long while, that craft stayed pointed inward. It let them keep their own numbers steady and slowly rebuild their home after the waters had taken it. But the deeper they sank into their work, the further they drifted from the rest of galactic society. The habit of minding only their own affairs had started in the Flood, and it only grew stronger with each passing generation. Eventually, though, they noticed something. There was a market out there for what they could do, and nobody else on the scene could offer it. So, with a good deal of reluctance and unease, the Kaminoans began trading their cloning services and their genetic knowledge to outsiders. In return, they received the supplies they needed but could not make for themselves, because a drowned world cannot grow or dig up everything a people requires. The clients who actually managed to find them got exactly what they paid for: flawless clones, built to order for whatever the buyer had in mind. Some commissioned laborers for rough places like the mining colonies of Subterral. Others wanted private security forces or quiet units made for slipping into places unseen, or single genetic jobs so specific they existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Whatever the request happened to be, the Kaminoans could fill it. This work took over nearly everything on the planet. Most of their cities were handed over largely to cloning projects, and their sharp and highly intelligent population organized its entire economy around producing and refining engineered life. Making living things to order was not some side business for Kamino. It was the heartbeat of the whole society. The government that ran all of this was every bit as ordered as the science. Kamino was led by a ruling council, and at the head of that council sat a prime minister, the chief executive of a tightly run world. The offices that managed the planet's affairs were kept in the towers of Tipoca City, the gleaming capital that rose high above the surf. Rank mattered a great deal to the Kaminoans, and they wore it right out in the open. The higher a Kaminoan stood in their society, the thicker the black cuffs ran along the sleeves of their tight white uniforms. It was a quiet and precise little signal. A way to read someone standing in the order without a single word being spoken aloud. Privacy was something the Kaminoans protected with real seriousness. They preferred to keep their cloning research behind closed doors, and their lonely position far out in wild space made that simple to do. Out there, away from curious eyes, they could run enormous projects with nobody watching over their shoulder. The distance did half the work of hiding for them. Their language was part of that wall too. The Kaminoans spoke their own tongue, and they were careful with its written form. The ones who dealt with outsiders learned to speak Galactic Basic so they could handle business. But very few outsiders ever learned to speak Kaminoan in return, and fewer still were ever taught how to read it. The words carved on their walls and kept in their records stayed theirs alone. Their secrecy reached so far that it crept into the galaxy's own star maps. Plenty of databases did not even list where Kamino actually was. The most you might find was a vague note about somewhere in wild space near the Rishi Maze, with nothing more exact than that. This was not some accident or oversight. The Kaminoans worked hard to keep it that way on purpose. Now we come to the science itself, which is where these people truly stood apart from everyone else. The process they perfected could take a single genetic donor and grow huge numbers of healthy, identical organisms out of that one source. And before any of them began to grow, the cloners could reach into the original genetic code and change it however they pleased. They were not copying life. They were quietly rewriting it on the way out the door. The precision involved was almost difficult to believe. Their geneticists could alter the traits of a template and get the exact result they wanted more than 90% of the time. Very few scientists anywhere in the galaxy could match a number like that. They could turn physical features up or down, soften or sharpen a temperament, speed up or slow down how fast something grew, and adjust all kinds of other details on demand. Their talents did not stop at people either. Kaminoan cloning reached well past humanoids and into the animal world. Engineering and adapting living creatures was part of the very same set of tools that had let them rebuild an entire planet's ecology after the flood. The same hands that could shape a person could just as easily shape a beast. They were enormously proud of all of it. The Kaminoans chased scientific honor without ever once letting up, treating every breakthrough as a badge of distinction. And yet for all that pride, they stayed strangely calm and untroubled about what became of their creations once those creations left the planet. Where their work ended up and what it was used for was none of their concern. When you put all of it together, you start to see why Kamino was so dangerous in the right hands. They had unmatched skill, total secrecy, deep isolation, and a complete detachment from the results of their own work. Gather those four things in one place and you have the perfect spot to hide a secret military project of enormous scale with no one in the wider galaxy any the wiser. Reaching the planet at all was a real chore, which suited the Kaminoans perfectly fine. Now and then a representative from a buyer would brave the storms and the distance to come inspect a job. Those visits were rare. The hard journey acted as one more filter, keeping all but the most determined clients far from their door. In their own minds, the Kaminoans saw themselves as keepers of knowledge that others were not ready for. They believed they were a superior and perfected people, refining genetic technologies that lesser species could neither understand nor handle in any responsible way. This was not bragging to them. It was just how they read the universe and their own place inside it. That self-image shaped the way they dealt with everyone. Relationships to a Kaminoan were transactions and very little else. Loyalty, belief, and sentiment barely entered into their dealings at all. A contract was a contract, plain and simple. And the largest contract that anyone could possibly dream up was, at that very moment, on its way to find them. Across the long centuries, they had also developed some unusual products on the side. Among them were specialized munitions, the Kyber darts and the later saber darts, distinctive little tools of Kaminoan make, whose true origin most of the galaxy could not even place. A dart like that could pass through a dozen hands and never once give away where it had come from. By the final century of the Republic, the picture was complete. Kamino had quietly grown into the single most capable cloning operation anywhere in existence. It was a hidden marvel of industry, humming away beneath the storms, waiting for a buyer rich enough and secretive enough to commission it to its full potential. And there was one more belief baked deep into these people, one that would come to matter more than almost anything else. The Kaminoans held that their creations belonged to them. A clone was property. That single idea, treated as plain legal and moral fact on Kamino, would one day define the heartbreaking status of the clone troopers themselves. So when the buyer finally did arrive, the Kaminoans were never going to ask too many questions. Secrecy was their business. Perfection was their pride. Payment was their whole reason for any of it. Everything was already in place. The science, the privacy, the distance, and the cool indifference, for Kamino to become the birthplace of the Grand Army of the Republic, and with it, the spark that would change the entire galaxy. The masters of genetics were ready at last for the one commission that would write their name into history forever, for better and for far worse. The buyer the Kaminoans had been waiting for finally arrived, and he was not at all what anyone might have expected. He was a single Jedi master, acting completely on his own, chasing a vision of a disaster that had not happened yet. To understand how the clone army truly began, you have to go back to the days before the invasion of Naboo, around 32 years before the Battle of Yavin. That was when a Jedi master named Sifo-Dyas became convinced that the Galactic Republic was heading toward a danger big enough to end it entirely. Sifo-Dyas was a human Jedi, and he was both respected and troubled by something he carried inside him. He had powerful visions of the future, the kind that the other Jedi did not share. In those visions, he saw a conflict coming, one that would spread across the whole galaxy. And from what he saw, he reached a firm conclusion. The Republic was going to need a standing army of its own if it wanted to survive what was on the way. He took these fears straight to the Jedi High Council. He laid out what he had seen and what he believed they needed to do about it. The Council turned him down flat. The idea of the Jedi raising an army cut against everything they stood for, and they would not even consider it. Worse for Sifo-Dyas, his refusal to let the matter go began to wear on his standing with them. That unsettling insistence of his was one of the things that eventually cost him his seat on the council. But losing his seat did nothing to change his mind. If anything, it only pushed him to act alone, quietly, and without telling anyone who might try to stop him. Sifo-Dyas reached out to the cloners of Kamino. He commissioned them to build a massive clone army for the Republic. He did this with no blessing from the Jedi Council and no blessing from the Senate. As far as the rest of the galaxy was concerned, this army did not even exist. He made contact with Kamino's Prime Minister Lama Su directly and placed his request, and here he told a lie that would carry enormous weight later on. He presented the whole commission as an official order coming from the Galactic Senate. That single piece of fiction meant the Kaminoans believed from the very first day that they were building soldiers for the Republic itself. The Kaminoans, true to who they were, did not dig into the claim at all. They cared about privacy, and they cared about payment. And checking the story behind a contract was not their habit. So, they accepted the enormous job and began laying out plans for the largest cloning project they had ever taken on across their long history. There is a darker possibility hiding underneath all of this. Some accounts say the money behind the project came through a shadowy financier named Jango Fett, a figure far better known by another name, Darth Plagueis. If that is true, then the army may have been paid for with Sith money from the very start, without Sifo-Dyas ever having the faintest idea. The man trying to protect the Republic might have been spending the enemy's coin to do it. Whatever the real source of the funding was, Sifo-Dyas himself acted with clean intentions. He meant the army purely as a safeguard. His conviction was sincere, even if it was reckless, and he honestly believed he was getting his civilization ready for a catastrophe that only he could see approaching. In his own mind, he was the only one doing the responsible thing. He even thought ahead to the danger of the army itself going wrong someday. As part of the design, Sifo-Dyas came up with the idea of a small chip to be placed inside the brain of each clone, an inhibitor built to keep their behavior in check. In its first form, this chip was a protective measure and nothing more. Its job was to make certain the soldiers could never be talked into obeying a Jedi who had turned corrupt or treacherous. That is worth sitting with for a moment because of what this chip would later become. At the start, it was a kind and careful failsafe. It existed to guarantee that a fallen Jedi could never grab hold of the Republic's own army and aim it back at the Republic. It was meant to be a shield. Years down the road, that very shield would be twisted into something monstrous, but that betrayal had not arrived yet. With the broad shape of the Order settled, Sifo-Dyas went back to his ordinary duties as a Jedi. He fully expected to keep an eye on the project as it grew and matured over the coming years. He had no reason at all to think he would not be around to see it through to the end. Around this same stretch of time, Supreme Chancellor Finis Valorum came to him with a job. Valorum knew that Sifo-Dyas understood the criminal underworld better than most, and he wanted that knowledge put to use. He asked Sifo-Dyas to handle a quiet diplomatic mission, traveling out to the moon of Obadiah to negotiate with a group called the Pike Syndicate. The Senate committee behind the mission wanted everything kept strictly under wraps. Because of that, Sifo-Dyas did not breathe a word of it to the Jedi Council. He set off with one of Valorum's aides, a man named Silman, and the two of them traveled out toward Obadiah. Neither of them realized they were walking straight into a trap. Back on Kamino, the scale of what Sifo-Dyas had ordered was something to behold. He had requested a fully trained and professionally equipped army numbering in the millions, all of it to be grown and conditioned on Kamino over roughly the next 10 years. This was a force built to win a war, prepared well in advance for a war that nobody else even knew was coming. The Kaminoans got to work with their usual precision. But before any growing could actually begin, they still needed one more crucial piece. They needed a single, exceptional individual to serve as the genetic foundation for the entire army. One template that every soldier would be built from. For one brief window of time, the clone army was exactly the thing Sifo-Dyas had pictured in his head. It was a secret insurance policy for a republic he sincerely loved, brought into being by one Jedi acting alone on the strength of a vision. Had things stayed that way, the story of these soldiers might have turned out very differently. But a project this large, this hidden, and this valuable was never going to stay buried for long. It was exactly the kind of opening the galaxy's most dangerous schemer had been hoping to find. The Sith had been waiting across many generations for a chance like this to fall into their laps. And this is the cruel heart of what Sifo-Dyas did. Without ever meaning to, he had built the perfect tool for the very catastrophe he was trying so hard to prevent. His foresight was real. The conflict he feared was real. But he never once grasped that he himself was helping to arm the darkness he saw rolling toward the Republic. His own choices only made it worse. By going around the council, lying to the Kaminoans about Senate approval, and hiding his movements from everyone who mattered, he left the entire project wide open to anyone clever enough to learn of it. He had built it in the shadows, and the shadows were exactly where the wrong people were waiting. And someone did learn of it. Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord, who was secretly steering the Republic from within, recognized the clone army for what it could become. To him, it was the missing piece of a plan he had been patiently building for decades. The vision of one well-meaning Jedi was about to be stolen, reshaped, and turned into the very thing that would one day bring down the Jedi Order from the inside. The Kaminoans, meanwhile, kept right on working in calm ignorance. They had no notion that the Republic contract they were so carefully fulfilling had already quietly passed into the hands of the Sith. They were building for one master while serving another, and they did not know it for a second. As for Sifo-Dyas, his name would go on to haunt the Jedi for the next 10 years. He became a mystery they could not solve, the master who had ordered an entire army that no one could remember ever authorizing. With the order placed, the funding secured, and the cloners hard at work, everything was now in position for the Sith to reach in and take control of the greatest weapon the masters of Kamino had ever been trusted to create. Sifo-Dyas believed the clone army was his own private secret. He was wrong about that, because 2 other men already knew it existed, and they had no plans to let him keep it. Those 2 men were the Sith. The first was Darth Sidious, who was secretly none other than Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, the smiling face sitting at the very top of the Republic. The second was his apprentice, a Sith Lord who went by the name Darth Tyranus. Together, they had uncovered Sifo-Dyas' hidden project on Kamino, and they decided to take it for themselves and fold it into a much longer game. Here is the part that truly stings. Darth Tyranus was not some stranger who had stumbled onto the plan. He was Count Dooku, a former Jedi Master who had recently walked away from the Jedi Order, fallen to the dark side, and become Sidious's apprentice. And Dooku had once been a friend of Sifo-Dyas. The man who would quietly unravel everything Sifo-Dyas built was someone Sifo-Dyas had trusted. To take full control of the army, the Sith had a problem to solve first. Sifo-Dyas was still alive, still expecting to oversee his project. And as long as he was around, the army was his and his alone. So the Sith decided he had to be removed. Dooku, wearing his Tyrannus identity, arranged the whole betrayal himself. In doing it, he fulfilled a grim Sith tradition, the kind that asked a Sith to turn against someone close to him in order to prove his loyalty to the dark side. The plan made use of the very mission we just walked through. Remember that quiet trip to the moon of Obadiah to deal with the Pike Syndicate? Dooku secretly paid those same Pikes to ambush Sifo-Dyas while he was out there. The Pikes brought his Jedi shuttle down, and Sifo-Dyas did not survive the crash that followed out near the Obadiah moon. The Jedi who had started all of this was suddenly gone. His traveling companion did not share the same fate. Valorum's aide, Silman, lived through the crash, but the Pikes took him prisoner. He became a loose end, a witness tucked away for years in a place no one would think to look. As for Sifo-Dyas himself, his body was handed over to Dooku, who made certain the truth about what had really happened stayed buried. To keep the Jedi from ever connecting the pieces, Dooku spread a cover story. He blamed the loss of Sifo-Dyas on a local conflict, something ordinary and unrelated. It pointed attention anywhere but at the Sith, and it made sure that no Jedi would ever link the master they had lost to the army quietly growing on a distant ocean world. Now Dooku needed to keep the Kaminoans in line. With Sifo-Dyas gone, he stepped into the empty space the lost master had left behind. Using the Tyrannus name, he carried on the relationship with Kamino as though nothing at all had changed. The Kaminoans never learned that the Jedi who first hired them had been removed and replaced by someone else entirely. To them, the contract continued exactly as normal. Then came one of the cleverest moves in the entire scheme. Dooku traveled to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the very heart of the Order. and he used Sifo-Dyas' own access codes to slip into the archives. Once inside, he deleted every trace of Kamino from the records. This was not something an outsider could ever pull off. Only a person with the access of a Jedi could reach into those files, which tells you just how deep this betrayal really ran. The animated series Tales of the Jedi later confirmed an important detail about the timing. Dooku erased Kamino from the archives while he was still a member of the Jedi Order, before he had openly broken away from it. That makes the whole thing an inside job, carried out by a trusted master who had already turned traitor in his heart while still wearing the robes. That single act of erasing the planet was brilliant in the worst possible way. It meant the army could keep right on growing for years with no one in the galaxy the wiser. And in a twist that would matter enormously later, that very gap in the records, a planet that should have been there and was not, would one day become the first clue that told the Jedi something had gone badly wrong. With the planet hidden and the Kaminoans handled, Sidious and Tyrannus turned their attention to the chip. This was the small safeguard Sifo-Dyas had designed to protect the Republic from any Jedi who turned bad. The Sith took that careful little protection and flipped its entire purpose on its head. They reworked it into the delivery system for a secret command, a hidden directive that the galaxy would one day come to know as Order 66. Think about how cruel that switch really was. The chip was first built to keep a corrupt Jedi from ever seizing the army. The Sith reprogrammed it to do the complete opposite. Instead of shielding the Republic's soldiers from a bad Jedi, it would now force the clones to turn on their own Jedi commanders the instant the command was given. The protection had become a weapon aimed at the very people it was first meant to defend, and the Kaminoans installed it without a clue. Tyrannus came to them posing as a loyal Jedi, still acting on Sifo-Dyas' original wishes. He presented the reworked chip to Prime Minister Lama Su and to Kamino's chief medical scientist, a brilliant woman named Nala Se. He lied to them both about what the chip actually did. They were told it remained nothing more than a harmless safety feature, a simple backup plan in case a Jedi ever went rogue. This is the detail that sits at the very center of the Kaminoan story. They built the instrument that would bring about the downfall of the Jedi, but they did it as fooled contractors, not as willing partners in the plot, at least not at this stage in the tale. They were craftsmen following an order with no idea what they were truly making. From this moment on, the clone army quietly answered to two masters at once. Out in the open, it belonged to the Republic that would soon command it in war. In secret, it belonged to the Sith who had stolen it and planted a hidden command deep inside every soldier. One army, two owners, and only one of them understood the full truth. The patience the Sith showed here is genuinely hard to take in. They were willing to wait a full 10 years, letting the army grow and train at its own pace, trusting that when the right moment finally came, those chips would hand the Jedi straight to them. They were playing a game measured in decades, and they were in no hurry whatsoever. There was still one task left that Tyrannus intended to handle himself. The army needed its genetic foundation, that single exceptional individual every soldier would be copied from, and Dooku planned to choose that person personally. Step back and look at everything the Sith had pulled off. They had removed Sifo-Dyas, slipped into his place, wiped Kamino off the map, and turned a kind protective device into a hidden weapon. With those 4 moves, They took one Jedi's well-meaning vision and reshaped it into a flawless trap. The Kaminoans took enormous pride in controlling everything around them, and yet they were the ones being controlled, unknowing pieces in a Sith plan that had quietly swallowed their entire project whole. From this point onward, the whole thing the galaxy would later call the Clone Wars was already running on hidden Sith tracks, and those tracks ran straight through the heart of Kamino. The conspiracy was now sealed up tight. There was a Jedi who was gone and could not answer a single question, an army that did not appear anywhere in the Order's own records, and a population of cloners who fully believed they served the Republic. Only a few faint clues managed to survive the cover-up. There was a planet missing from the archives, a timeline that did not quite line up, and a single strange dart that would surface years down the road. But it would take a very long time before any Jedi began pulling at those loose threads. For now, with Sifo-Dyas silenced and the Kaminoans deceived, the Sith turned to the final ingredient of their weapon. They needed the one man whose face and whose body would soon belong to an entire army. Every soldier in this army would have to be copied from one single living person. The Sith found that person in the most dangerous bounty hunter the entire galaxy had to offer. Before the Kaminoans could start growing anything, they needed their original. They needed one remarkable person whose genetic code every single clone would be built from, the source that the whole army would share. And the choice of who that person would be did not fall to the cloners. Darth Tyranus handled that part himself. The man he picked was Jango Fett. Jango was a human Mandalorian and a bounty hunter, and in his time he was widely seen as the single finest mercenary anyone could hire anywhere in the galaxy. If you wanted the best, you wanted Jango, and everyone in that line of work knew it. Tyrannus did not take Jango's reputation at his word. According to some accounts, he put the bounty hunter to the test first. He hired Jango to go after a target named Komari Vosa, who happened to be Dooku's own former Padawan. Jango came out of that job the winner, and that result proved his skill in a way no reputation ever could. Dooku had also reportedly watched Jango get the better of several Jedi while completely unarmed. A man who could handle trained Jedi with nothing but his own two hands was exactly the kind of fighter worth copying on a massive scale. The Kaminoans, for their part, did not push back on the choice at all. Jango's standing as the greatest bounty hunter alive was credential enough for them. These were perfectionists who trusted excellence the moment they saw it, and Jango was excellence in human form. There was nothing left to argue about. But Jango did not agree to any of this for free. In exchange for becoming the genetic source of an entire army, he asked for two things. The first was a large sum of money, which was no surprise at all for a man in his profession. The second request was far more unusual and a great deal more personal. Beyond his payment, Jango asked for a single clone of himself. He did not want a soldier, though. He wanted one copy left completely unaltered, with none of the changes the Kaminoans planned to make to the troops. There would be no engineered obedience and no speeding up of how fast he aged. It would just be a pure version of himself, one that Jango intended to keep and raise as his own son. That clone became Boba Fett. Boba was a perfect genetic match for Jango. free of every adjustment forced onto the soldiers, and Jango brought him up as a child. While millions of others were being shaped into an army, this one boy was being raised by his father. Years later, Prime Minister Lama Su would bring up this strange request when he spoke with the Jedi Obi-Wan Kenobi. He pointed out how curious it was that, aside from his sizable fee, all Jango had wanted was that one unaltered clone for himself. To the Kaminoans, it was a small oddity, a footnote attached to a giant contract. They had no real idea why a hardened bounty hunter would want a son. The fuller answer only came to light much later on. Jango was himself a Mandalorian foundling, a child who had been taken in and raised within Mandalorian culture. By raising Boba as his son, he was doing something deeply rooted in that very tradition. He was carrying on a clan and a legacy the way Mandalorians had always done. This was never just a passing want. It was Jango continuing who he was. While the army developed, Jango lived right there on Kamino. He kept an apartment in Tipoca City and watched over the early stages of the project with young Boba at his side. A father and son shared a home in the middle of the strangest factory in the galaxy. Here is the odd thing about Jango, though. He took no pride whatsoever in the soldiers grown from his own cells. He looked at the clones and saw the Kaminoans' livestock, their creations, beings grown only to fight and to be used up in battle. To him, they were not his sons in any real sense. They were nothing more than product to him. When the Kaminoan aide Ton Wei assumed that Jango would feel proud of his clones, he set her straight without any warmth at all. He told her plainly that the soldiers were the Kaminoans' achievement and not his. For Jango, this whole thing was another job he had been paid to do. The army wearing his face meant nothing to him on a personal level. And yet his fingerprints were all over those soldiers in ways that went far past their faces. Every clone training program was built with Jango's direct input, his own way of fighting, his instincts, his hard-earned combat doctrine. All of it was woven into how millions of soldiers were taught to handle a battlefield. The clones did not just look like Jango. Deep down, they fought like him too. To carry out that training, a hidden group was brought in. Jango gathered a secret team of 100 elite mercenaries, a cadre known as the Kuival-Dar, which included the Mandalorian Cull. These hand-picked warriors trained the very first clone commandos and ARC troopers in total isolation, passing along skills that few others anywhere in the galaxy could match. There is one more piece worth flagging here because it becomes important much later. Boba was not actually the only perfect copy of Jango the Kaminoans would ever make. A second unaltered, first-generation clone would be grown somewhere down the line. That detail might seem minor right now, but it would come to matter a great deal after the war was over. Jango's own story did not last nearly as long as the army he helped create. At the First Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, Jango fell, struck down by the Jedi Master Mace Windu. With him gone, the Kaminoans were left holding only a limited and slowly weakening supply of his original genetic material. The source of their masterpiece had been lost, and what little they had of him would only fade further with time. But by then, the most important part of Jango was already secured. His genetic legacy lived on inside the bodies of millions of clone troopers who carried his face, his voice, and his trained reflexes into battle. In a sense, Jango was everywhere now, marching across the galaxy in countless identical copies. That choice of a Mandalorian as the template handed the army a hidden bloodline that almost nobody ever thought about. Genetically speaking, the soldiers of the Republic were the sons of a Mandalorian warrior, a man who held no loyalty to the Jedi whatsoever. The Jedi would soon be leading an army descended from someone who had spent his life standing on the other side of them. The same man meant something completely different to everyone who looked at him. The Kaminoans saw an ideal source to copy from, nothing more. The Sith saw a perfect foundation, one they fully intended to throw away the moment it had served its purpose. And to his son Boba, he was none of those cold things. He was a father, and losing him would go on to shape the rest of Boba's life. When you put Kaminoan genetic mastery together with Jango Fett's skill in combat, you got something the galaxy had never seen before. You got a soldier who was disciplined, capable, and by careful design, obedient. It was a combination built to win. With the template chosen and the donor settled on Kamino, the cloners could finally begin the real work. The work that would carve their species into galactic memory forever. The army that grew from Jango Fett's cells would go on to win a war, end an age, and topple an entire order of knights. And all of it came from the body of one bounty hunter who never felt a single shred of pride in them. And in the quiet figure of that unaltered son, in Boba, the truest part of the template would carry on. He would still be standing long after the soldiers, the Kaminoans, and Jango himself had all faded away. With their template finally chosen, the Kaminoans could begin the one project they had been preparing their whole civilization to take on. What followed inside Tipoca City became the largest and most careful piece of work these people had ever attempted. This was their masterwork. Across the cloning complexes of Tipoca City, the Kaminoans grew and trained a professional army of millions, every last one of them drawn from the genome of Jango Fett. It was an entire fighting force, built from a single man, one copy at a time. Tipoca City was the capital of Kamino, and it was enormous. The city was a web of domed structures spread across roughly 90 miles of ocean near the planet's equator. It served two jobs at the very same time. It was the seat of the Kaminoan government, and it was also the beating center of the entire cloning operation. Everything that mattered on the planet ran through this place. Now the Kaminoans did not make plain copies of Jango. That was never the plan. They reached into his genetic structure and changed it on purpose. They wanted the clones to be calmer, more obedient, and far less independent than the man they came from. Jango was fiercely his own person, and that was exactly the trait the Kaminoans wanted to dial back. A soldier who thinks too much for himself is harder to command, and command was the entire point of the exercise. They also changed how fast the clones grew up. The Kaminoans engineered them to age at twice the speed of a normal human being. A clone could reach full physical and combat readiness in about half the time it would take anyone else. This was not some accidental side effect. It was the reason the army could be ready to deploy within roughly 10 years. The improvements did not stop there. The cloners fine-tuned the template for war in a dozen small ways. They gave the clones greater lung capacity, built up their stamina, and sharpened their reaction times. They also quietly removed a few flaws that Jango himself had carried, including a mild problem with his eyesight and certain allergies. The clones were, in a real sense, a cleaned-up and battle-ready version of their original. Then came the part that nobody outside the conspiracy understood. Into the brain of nearly every clone, at the third stage of its development as an embryo, the Kaminoans placed a small chip. This was the behavior-changing device, the very same inhibitor the Sith had quietly reworked behind everyone's back. As far as the Kaminoans knew, the chip held back any aggression or instability the clones might have picked up from Jango, and guarded against a Jedi who might one day turn bad. They had no idea that the same chip carried a sleeping command, one that would eventually be known as Order 66. A clone's life moved through carefully managed stages. It started as an engineered embryo and moved into a sped-up childhood. From there, the young clones were raised, drilled, and educated together in tightly run groups inside the facility. Nothing about their upbringing was ever left to chance. The training itself was intense. Young clones went through rapid flash training and heavy combat instruction, all of it shaped around Jango's own fighting methods. And here is what set them apart from the battle droids the galaxy would later face. Unlike a droid, a clone could think on his feet. He could be creative. He could adapt to a situation that did not go according to plan. That made them something far more useful than mindless machines. To the Kaminoans, these soldiers were their crowning accomplishment. The clones were the highest form of their genetic art, the finest thing their science had ever produced. And in keeping with everything we know about these people, the Kaminoans still considered the troopers to be property of their government, even after the soldiers had been delivered for service. A clone could be handed over to fight for the Republic and still, in Kaminoan eyes, belong entirely to Kamino. A couple of clones stood apart from the endless ranks of identical soldiers. The first was Boba Fett, Jango's unaltered son, who we already met. The second was created later and named Omega. Omega was a unique clone of Jango as well, unaltered and first generation just like Boba, and she was a young female who would come to serve as an assistant to Kamino's chief medical scientist. Both of them carried pure, untouched Fett genetics, and both would matter enormously once the army's days were numbered. It is worth pausing on the small handful of Kaminoans who actually ran all of this, because they shaped the whole story. At the top stood Prime Minister Lama Su, the calm and businesslike face of the operation. Throughout the entire project, Lama Su led Kamino's government and treated this army as the single greatest contract his people had ever landed. To him, it was the deal of a lifetime, plain and simple. Working alongside him was Taun We, a senior administrator and aide. Taun We was the gracious one, the official who welcomed visitors to the planet and dealt directly with Jango Fett across the long years of development. If an outsider ever came to Kamino, Taun We was often the first Kaminoan they would meet. And then there was Nala Se, Kamino's chief medical scientist, one of the principal minds behind the clones themselves. Nala Se was brilliant, and she was also cold. She would tend to injured troopers with real medical skill, and in the very same breath she would insist that those troopers were disposable property and nothing more. She was also one of the very few Kaminoans who actually knew about Clone Protocol 66, the hidden command buried inside the chips. And she would go to remarkable lengths to keep that secret safe on behalf of the project's true masters. The sheer size of the work is staggering. The Kaminoans kept long rows of growth chambers, training halls, barracks, and laboratories, all of them running without pause, beneath the planet's endless storms. The facility never truly went quiet. Day and night, the work of building an arm carried on, and almost nobody knew it was even happening. Because the whole project was grown in total secrecy, far out in remote wild space, the Republic and the Jedi had no idea that their future military was being produced light years past the Outer Rim. The most important army in the galaxy was being assembled, and the very people it was meant to serve had never once heard of it. There was one thing the Kaminoans could not fully engineer away, though. The clones were given numbers instead of names, along with identical faces and matching voices. But even with all of that engineered obedience, the soldiers slowly became individuals anyway. They picked out their own names, grew real personalities, and formed deep loyalties to one another, the kind of bonds that no chip could ever account for. Underneath the matching armor, they were quietly becoming people. For roughly 10 years, this work went on. The Kaminoans grew and trained the army all the way to completion, refining each new batch with the same perfectionism that had always defined them, while Jango and young Boba lived among them the entire time. By the end, what they had built was the Grand Army of the Republic, sitting and waiting. It was a fully equipped and professionally trained force of millions, hidden on a stormy world, ready for a war that had not officially started yet. Every single soldier in that army carried 3 things at once, all bound up together. They carried Jango's face, the Kaminoans' careful engineering, and the Sith's hidden command sleeping quietly inside their heads. It was a perfect weapon, and not one of the people who built it fully understood what it truly was. In effect, the Kaminoans had manufactured the future of the entire galaxy to order, and they did it without the slightest notion of what they were really doing. They believed they were filling a contract for the Republic. What they were actually doing was arming the very soldiers who would one day bring about the fall of the Jedi and the rise of an empire. All that was left now was for the rest of the galaxy to find out the army even existed, and for the Republic to claim a force it never knew it had ordered. That discovery was coming. It would arrive in the form of a single Jedi, pulling at a loose thread in an investigation exactly 10 years after the order was first placed. Before that day came, the daily routine on Kamino ground steadily on. Clone cadets lived and drilled in their tightly managed groups inside Tipoca City, working their way through brutal physical, marksmanship, and tactical tests before they could earn the rank of trooper. The Kaminoans also kept careful genetic records of the Fett template, guarding that archive of his DNA as one of the most valuable assets anywhere on the entire planet. Their cold efficiency showed in the harder moments too. Clones that came out defective, or that did not match the standard, were marked for reconditioning or removal, exactly the way the Kaminoans had always handled imperfection. This was a practice that the Jedi who later oversaw the troops would push back against more and more. On top of the standard soldiers, the cloners also developed specialized versions from the same template, including clone commandos and the elite advanced recon commandos, all of them trained to operate with far more independence than the regular ranks. The masterwork was complete, and the galaxy was about to walk right into it. For 10 years, the army on Kamino had grown in perfect silence, hidden from the very galaxy it was built to serve. All it took to crack that silence wide open was one small dart and one curious Jedi. The galaxy first caught wind of Kamino's secret army in 22 BBY, during a tense period known as the Separatist Crisis. It started with a plot to harm Senator Padme Amidala. Someone wanted the senator gone, and the Jedi were pulled in to protect her, which quietly set them onto a trail that nobody saw coming. The man behind those attacks was Jango Fett, working in secret for the Sith. Jango had used a partner for the job, a shape-shifting bounty hunter named Zam Wesell. But when Zam was captured and looked like she might start talking, Jango made sure she never got the chance. He silenced her with a distinctive little saber dart before she could give anything away, and then he slipped off into the night. That dart turned out to be his mistake. The Jedi Knight Obi-Wan Kenobi recovered it from the scene, and he could not figure out where it had come from. It did not match anything in the usual records, so Obi-Wan took it to an old friend of his, a cook named Dexter Jetster, who knew his way around obscure gear. Dexter took one look at the dart and knew it on sight. This was Kaminoan work, he told Obi-Wan, made by the cloners of a world called Kamino. Armed with that name, Obi-Wan went to the Jedi archives to look up Kamino, and he found nothing at all. There was no record of the planet anywhere in the files. We already know exactly why. Dooku had erased Kamino from those archives a full decade earlier. When Obi-Wan brought the strange gap to Master Yoda, Yoda understood something chilling about it. The records could only have been wiped by someone with Jedi-level access, which meant the betrayal had come from inside their own order. Rather than give up, Obi-Wan trusted his friend's lead. Dexter had handed him the coordinates of where Kamino should be, so Obi-Wan flew out into wild space to go see for himself. And there it was, a storm-battered ocean world sitting exactly where the archives swore nothing existed. The planet had been scrubbed from the galaxy's own maps, and Obi-Wan had just found it anyway. When he landed in Tipoca City, the welcome he received was not at all what he expected. A Kaminoan administrator named Ton Wei greeted him warmly, almost as if she had been waiting for him to show up. And in a way, she had. The Kaminoans had been expecting a Jedi visitor for some time, and they assumed Obi-Wan was that Jedi finally arriving to check on the army. This is where the misunderstanding turned into something far bigger. The Kaminoans believed Obi-Wan had been sent by the Jedi Council and the Senate to inspect the project. That project, they explained, had been ordered roughly 10 years earlier by a Jedi Master named Sifo-Dyas. Obi-Wan had never once heard that name in his life. He kept his confusion to himself and let them keep talking. Prime Minister Lama Su personally welcomed Kenobi and proudly walked him through the good news. There was a clone army already finished, he explained, about 200,000 units strong, with another 1,000,000 more on the way. All of it, he said, was being grown for the Republic. Obi-Wan was standing there hearing about an enormous secret army that his own leaders had apparently never approved. Then Lama Su added the detail that made everything worse. He told Obi-Wan the army had been ordered by Sifo-Dyas in the name of the Senate. But Obi-Wan knew something that Lama Su did not. As far as the Jedi understood it, Sifo-Dyas had been gone for years before this army was supposedly commissioned. The timeline did not line up, and Obi-Wan could feel it in his gut. Ton Wei and Lama Su then gave him the full tour, and it was a lot to take in. They walked him past the growth chambers, showed him the cadets in training, and displayed row after row of soldiers being produced on a massive scale, all of them wearing one identical face. To the Kaminoans, this was a proud showcase of their finest work. To Obi-Wan, it was deeply unsettling. and then he learned whose face it actually was. The Army's genetic template, the man every one of these soldiers had been copied from, was the bounty hunter Jango Fett. This was the very same man Obi-Wan suspected of being behind the attacks on Senator Amidala. The trail he had been chasing and the army he had just stumbled onto were suddenly one and the same case. Obi-Wan went to meet Jango face to face in his apartment in Tipoca City. The conversation between them was tense and careful. After a quiet word with young Boba at his side, Jango claimed he had never heard of any Sifo-Dyas. He said he had been recruited for the work by a different man entirely, someone who went by the name Tyrannus. That name meant nothing to Obi-Wan yet, but it was one more thread to pull. By now, Obi-Wan understood he was standing in the middle of something genuinely dangerous. He reported everything he had found to Yoda and Mace Windu back on Coruscant. The Council looked into it, and they confirmed the worst part of all. Neither the Jedi nor the Senate had ever authorized this army. Someone had built a force of millions in the Republic's name without a single official ever signing off on it, and nobody could explain how. Jango, meanwhile, had figured out that Obi-Wan was not the inspector the Kaminoans believed him to be. Knowing he was compromised, Jango grabbed Boba, and the two of them ran for their ship. Obi-Wan tried to stop them, and the two of them fought across a landing platform while the planet's storms raged all around them. But Jango and Boba managed to break away and escape, setting a course for a world called Geonosis. Obi-Wan followed them there, and Geonosis cracked the whole conspiracy open even wider. On that planet, he uncovered the leadership of the separatist movement, discovered Count Dooku's role in all of it, and found a massive droid army being built for war. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that would help push the entire galaxy from a tense standoff into open conflict. As the separatist crisis fell apart into actual war, the Galactic Senate handed Supreme Chancellor Palpatine sweeping emergency powers. The stated reason was simple enough. The Republic needed a military to face the separatist threat, and it needed one fast. It sounded like a desperate but reasonable answer to a crisis, but Palpatine, who was secretly Darth Sidious the entire time, knew exactly where to find that military. He used his new powers to immediately activate the clone army the Kaminoans had spent a decade building. In one single move, he pulled a fully built military seemingly out of nowhere, except it was not out of nowhere at all. It was the very secret his own Sith Order had been hiding the whole time. The clones got their first real deployment at the first battle of Geonosis. They arrived just in time to rescue a Jedi strike team that had been surrounded and badly outnumbered, and they scattered the separatist forces in the process. It was the opening battle of a conflict that would go on to consume the galaxy. The clones had finally stepped onto the stage. That same battle was also where the army's genetic source reached the end of his own story. Jango Fett fell in the fighting, brought down facing Mace Windu, and young Boba was suddenly left without a father. With Jango gone, the Kaminoans were now working with only a limited store of his original genetic material, a shortage that would come back to trouble them later. The war itself was named after the soldiers Kamino had produced. They called it the Clone Wars, which means that for as long as the galaxy remembers this conflict, it will carry the mark of the Kaminoans' hidden handiwork right there in its very name. In one fast sequence of events, the Kaminoans went from secret contractors to the single most important suppliers in the entire galaxy. Their stormy, hidden world had suddenly become essential to the Republic's whole war effort. Everyone needed what Kamino made. There is a cruel irony sitting at the center of all of this. Obi-Wan's discovery should have blown the lid clean off a Sith conspiracy. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It handed Palpatine the army he had always wanted, right on schedule. The Jedi, with no idea what they were truly doing, took command of the very soldiers that had been engineered to one day turn against them. For Kamino, the long age of secrecy was finally over, and the age of war had begun. The isolated world that had spent so long hiding from everyone was now a key piece on the galactic board, courted by allies and targeted by enemies in equal measure. The stranger had arrived, the army had been revealed, and the Clone Wars had officially begun, which left the Kaminoans standing at the very center of galactic history, with no road left back to the quiet life they had always known. Kamino had spent most of its long history as a planet that almost no one in the galaxy had ever heard of. Then, in the span of a single war, this lonely storm world suddenly found itself holding a seat at the most powerful table in the entire Republic. Building the grand army of the Republic changed everything for the Kaminoans. Overnight, a people who had spent ages tucked away in the shadows were pushed into the bright center of galactic affairs. The Republic officially recognized Kamino and handed the planet something it had never had before: a seat in the Galactic Senate. The cloners were now players in galactic politics. The Kaminoan who filled that seat was a senator named Halle Burtoni. Burtoni was sharp, steady, and completely unsentimental, and she poured all of that energy into one single goal. She wanted to make sure her people squeezed every possible benefit out of the war that was now raging across the stars. Burtoni was not there to make friends. She was there to win for Kamino. She and her government strongly backed making more clones, and then making even more after that. To them, the war was two good things wrapped into one. It was a duty they were fulfilling for the Republic, and it was also an enormously profitable business for Kamino. Every fresh batch of soldiers meant more credits flowing back home, and Burtoni intended to keep that flow wide open. That stance put her on a collision course with another familiar senator. Padme Amidala led a group that wanted to cool the war down, rein in the spending, and place limits on a military that kept growing without end. Burtoni wanted the opposite of all of that. Where Padme pushed for restraint, Burtoni pushed for production, and the two of them clashed in the Senate again and again. For the Kaminoans, that Senate seat was a kind of payment for their craftsmanship. In a real sense, they had traded their creation of the clones for a formal voice in the Republic itself. They had built an army, and the reward was a place at the table where the biggest decisions got made. It was exactly the kind of cool, business-like bargain these people had always loved. But not everything was running smoothly. The loss of Jango Fett at Geonosis had left the Kaminoans with a real problem. Their original template was gone, and all they had left of him was a limited supply of his genetic material that was slowly breaking down over time. Every new clone drawn from that aging source stretched it a little thinner. Prime Minister Lama Su started to worry about what that meant for quality. He feared that clones grown from the worn-down, overstretched DNA would not be as capable as the earlier soldiers. So he made a suggestion to the Jedi. He recommended that they go find a fresh and superior genetic template to replace Jango, someone new to build the next generation from. Not everyone agreed with that idea, and the strongest pushback came from an unexpected place. The Jedi had stationed one of their own on Kamino to act as a liaison, a Jedi Master named Shaak Ti. Her job was to oversee the training of the clones and to look after their welfare. And Shaak Ti argued firmly that the existing Fett clones were well worth keeping rather than tossing the template aside for a brand new one. Shaak Ti went further than just policy, though. She took a real and personal interest in the cadets who were struggling, including a group called Domino Squad. She stood up for the individuality and the potential of these young troopers, even when the Kaminoans wanted to set aside or write off the ones who were falling behind. To her, these were not failed products. They were people who deserved a chance to grow. And that difference in viewpoint is one of the most important things happening on Kamino during the war. On one side stood Jedi like Shaak Ti, who were starting to see the clones as actual people with their own worth. On the other side stood Kaminoans like Nala Se, who held firm that the troopers were nothing more than property to be used and replaced. Those two views could never be reconciled, and the gap between them only grew wider as the war dragged on. There is a haunting detail sitting underneath all of this. The Jedi oversaw the training of the younger clones for the entire length of the war. That meant Jedi Masters were standing inside these facilities day after day, working closely with the very soldiers who had been engineered to one day turn on them. The trap was already built. The people walking right past it had no idea it was there, and the chips inside the clones waited. Kamino's new importance was a double-edged thing. Being the one and only source of the clone army made the planet completely essential, but it also made it dangerously exposed. The entire Republic war effort now leaned on the output of a single, faraway world. If anything happened to Kamino, the whole machine could grind to a sudden halt. Back in the Senate, Burtoni worked the politics expertly. She kept Kamino's interests front and center in every debate over military funding, troop production numbers, and how much priority to place on defending the cloning facilities themselves. She understood her leverage, and she used it without hesitation. The Kaminoans, true to who they had always been, treated the war as a contract to be squeezed for everything it was worth, not as a cause they actually believed in. Their monopoly was a tool, and they worked it hard for political and financial gain. Beneath all the deal-making and the commerce, the engineered obedience of the clones held perfectly steady. The inhibitor chips stayed exactly where they had been placed, quiet and dormant, while Kaminoans and Jedi worked shoulder to shoulder with the soldiers. Among the cadets training in those halls were future legends like Echo and Fives of Domino Squad. These young men drilled and dreamed and bonded with their brothers in the very same rooms where the Sith's hidden command sat, waiting inside their heads. Here is the catch the Kaminoans did not fully appreciate. Their political power was never truly solid. It rested entirely on one thing, the Republic's need for clones. And a need can change. Some future government might one day decide that it no longer required what Kamino had to offer. And if that ever happened, all of this influence would vanish in an instant. For the moment, though, the Kaminoans were riding higher than they ever had before. They held influence they had never known, a seat in the Senate, a vital strategic role in the war, and a steady stream of credits pouring in from a galaxy at war. The same emotional distance that allowed them to sell soldiers without a flicker of guilt also let them play galactic politics with cold precision, lining up behind whoever happened to serve Kamino's interests in the moment. But all of that prominence came with a serious downside. By making themselves the only producers of the Republic's army, the Kaminoans had effectively painted a giant target on their stormy world. The Confederacy of Independent Systems, the separatist enemy, saw Kamino clearly for what it was. They understood that crippling the planet, or stealing Jango's precious genetic record, could cut off the Republic's supply of new soldiers entirely. And so the separatists began making plans to strike at the clone homeworld directly. That is the price that came attached to Kamino's seat at the galactic table. The planet that had managed to hide from the rest of the galaxy for 19,000 years was now one of the most fought-over worlds in the entire war. The Kaminoans had finally gotten everything their pride could ever want: recognition, influence, and profit, all at once. And yet the very war they had armed was already starting to turn back around toward their own shores. It is also worth noting that Burtoni's presence in the Senate gave the wider galaxy a rare, direct look at a Kaminoan. Even on a crowded and worldly planet like Coruscant, a member of their reclusive species was an unusual sight. So Burtoni became, for a great many people, the face of an entire species. And through her, an awkward truth kept surfacing again and again. The Kaminoans insisted the clones were their property, and yet the Republic was using those very same clones as living soldiers. Were these troopers people, or were they possessions? It was a question about personhood that nobody managed to settle during the war, and it sat uneasily beneath every single transaction. In the end, behind every funding debate hid the same uncomfortable fact, and Burtoni used it without mercy. The Republic could not fight its war without Kamino. That one reality handed a small, storm-bound world an enormous amount of leverage over the greatest power in the galaxy. Their political climb had set the stage for what was coming next, the moment the war finally came home, when the separatists launched a full assault aimed straight at the source of the clones. The Kaminoans had armed an entire galaxy for war from the safety of their hidden world. Now that very same war was about to come crashing through their own front door. The reason was simple enough. Kamino was the one and only source of the Republic's army, which made it an obvious target for the enemy. The Confederacy of Independent Systems, the Separatists, marked the planet for attack. They had two possible goals in mind. They could bring down the cloning facilities entirely, or they could steal away a sample of Jango Fett's genetic record. Either one would deal a heavy blow to the Republic. By this stage of the war, Jango's DNA had become a military asset of the highest possible value. Whoever controlled that genetic code controlled the Republic's ability to grow new soldiers. That made it a prize worth launching a full-scale invasion to capture. A single sample of genetic material had become one of the most important objects in the entire galaxy. The trouble started before the main attack even reached Kamino. Out on the nearby Rishi moon sat a small Republic listening post, a quiet little station whose whole job was to serve as an early warning system. If anything came creeping toward the clone homeworld, Rishi Station was supposed to catch it first and sound the alarm. The Separatists knew that, so they hit Rishi quietly and fast. Their forces slipped in with a stealth attack, overran the outpost, and in a desperate close-quarters fight, most of the young clones stationed there were lost. These were rookies, some of them barely out of training, and they were caught in a fight they had little chance of winning. Among those rookies were members of Domino Squad, the same group of cadets we met earlier. When the dust finally settled at Rishi, only 2 of them were still standing. Echo and Fives made it through, and before they pulled out, they brought the whole station down themselves, using its destruction as a signal to warn Kamino that an invasion was on the way. Their quick thinking bought the clone homeworld some precious time. That bravery did not go unnoticed. For what they did at Rishi, and for the part they played in defending Kamino afterward, Echo and Fives were brought into the famous 501st Legion. Later on, the 2 of them were raised up into the elite ranks of the Advanced Recon Commandos, the ARC Troopers. 2 survivors of a small outpost had become 2 of the most respected soldiers in the whole army. Then came the main event. In 21 BBY, the Separatists launched the Battle of Kamino, a massive invasion that came by both sea and air, aimed squarely at Tipoca City and the cloning facilities inside it. This was the attack the entire war had been building toward, and it landed right on the Kaminoans' doorstep. Leading the charge were 2 of the most feared figures the Separatists had. The first was the cyborg General Grievous, a towering mechanical commander. The second was the dark side warrior Asajj Ventress. Their plan was to break into the facility and get their hands on a sample of the original Jango Fett genome, the very thing that kept the Republic's army growing. The Republic was not about to let that happen. Its forces rallied to defend the clone homeworld, and they brought serious leadership to the fight. Jedi Generals Shaak Ti, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Anakin Skywalker coordinated the defense, and they did it standing right alongside the very clones that Tipoca City had produced. The soldiers were defending the place that had made them, with the Jedi fighting at their side. The battle tore through the storm-lashed towers and the flooded platforms of Tipoca City. Droid forces clashed against clone troopers across the high walkways and the rain-soaked landing pads, with the planet's endless weather raging the entire time. The whole city turned into a battlefield, every level of it contested. And here is the part that stays with you. The clones were fighting desperately to protect the facility that had engineered them. In a very real sense, they were defending their birthplace, the closest thing any of them had to an actual home. These soldiers had been grown and raised and trained right here, and now they were fighting for it with everything they had. The irony was heavy. The Kaminoans saw the clones as product, but the clones saw Kamino as home. In the end, the Republic held. The Battle of Kamino finished as a hard-won victory for the Republic, and the Separatists walked away with nothing at all. They failed to steal Jango's genetic record, and they failed to bring down the cloning operation. The army's source remained safe, and the soldiers kept right on coming. After the fighting was over, Captain Rex looked at the situation and figured the Separatists were unlikely to come back at Kamino anytime soon. The promotions to ARC Trooper status marked a real turning point, a moment when 2 young soldiers stepped fully into who they were going to become. They had earned their place the hard way. Kamino did not stop being a prize, though. It remained a contested target all the way through the war. In another clash, The Jedi General Kit Fisto led the defense of the planet against a fresh wave of separatist droid forces. The enemy kept coming back, over and over, because the value of the place never changed. Every one of these attacks pointed to the same strange truth about Kamino. The planet's output was absolutely vital to the Republic, but that very importance is exactly what made it a constant target. Being essential and being safe are not the same thing, and Kamino was learning that lesson the hard way. Through it all, the Kaminoans themselves stayed oddly removed from the fighting. They kept their production lines running calmly, even as battles raged around their towers, as confident as ever that these soldiers were theirs to use up however the war demanded. To them, losing some clones in a defense was a cost of doing business. The clones did not see it that way at all. For them, defending Kamino was deeply personal in a way their makers never really understood. The Kaminoans were guarding an investment. The clones were guarding the only home they had ever known, no matter how cold the people who ran it happened to be. The Battle of Kamino also put something else on display. It showed off the clones' growing individuality and their ability to think and act on their own. These were qualities the Kaminoans had built into them on purpose to make them better on the battlefield. But that same independence would later make the Empire deeply nervous about these soldiers, a problem for another day. And underneath every moment of it, the inhibitor chips kept their silence. They stayed hidden and undetected, sitting quietly inside every trooper, even as those troopers put themselves in harm's way to protect the very Kaminoans who had placed the chips there to begin with. The soldiers were defending their makers, and their makers had buried a secret weapon inside their heads. The successful defense meant the machine kept right on running. Kamino continued to grow and train fresh groups of soldiers, feeding the Republic's armies across countless battlefronts. The war effort never paused for a moment. As long as Kamino stood, the Republic had its soldiers. But all these relentless attacks hinted at something darker waiting in the future. The clone homeworld's entire value was tied to one war and to one need, and neither of those things was going to last forever. The day that need ended, Kamino's whole reason for mattering would end right along with it. The storms of war battered Kamino, but they did not break it. The planet endured everything the Separatists threw at it. And yet the greatest danger it would ever face was not coming from droid armies at all. It was coming from the very Republic that Kamino served so faithfully. As the war ground on, that deepest threat began to take shape. It would not arrive as an invasion fleet. It was already inside the clones themselves in the form of a hidden flaw that had been planted in them from the very start. And in the final years of the war, that flaw very nearly came to light. For one terrible moment, the entire Sith conspiracy and the Kaminoans' quiet part in it stood right on the edge of being exposed. The thing that almost gave it all away was not a spy or battle. It was a single chip inside a single clone that started to go wrong. The defense of Kamino had asked a great deal of everyone involved. It meant coordinating clone aquatic troopers, fighter screens overhead, and the planet's own storm-shrouded geography, all of it working together to turn the towers and platforms of Tipoca City into a layered fortress. Holding the world took everything they had, and it mattered enormously, because losing Kamino would have been a catastrophe for the Republic. There was no backup source of trained soldiers waiting somewhere else. No other world could do what Kamino did. That made every defense of the planet a true necessity. The endless fighting did leave one good thing behind. It hardened the bonds between the clones and the handful of Jedi, like Shaak Ti, who genuinely respected them as people. Those were real relationships, built in the middle of a war. And they were exactly the relationships that the inhibitor chips would one day tear apart. Everything the Sith had built, and everything the Kaminoans had quietly gone along with, almost fell apart in a single moment. And it all came down to one tiny chip inside one ordinary soldier. It happened in the third year of the war, around 19 BBY. The entire Sith plan, along with the Kaminoans' role in covering it up, came dangerously close to falling apart. And the cause was something almost nobody would have expected. It was a single faulty inhibitor chip. The trouble began during the Battle of Ringo Vinda. A clone trooper named CT-5385, who went by Tup, started complaining of a severe headache in the middle of the fighting. What no one realized was that the chip inside his head had begun to misfire. It activated early and only partly, slipping Tup into a strange daze he could not control. Then the unthinkable happened. Still locked in that daze, Tup raised his weapon, turned it on the Jedi General Tipoca, and struck her down right there on the battlefield. She was gone in an instant. The Republic forces around him were stunned, and they were forced to fall back in confusion, unable to understand what they had just witnessed. What they did not know was the true meaning of what Tup had done. His chip had fired off the hidden command early, the one buried inside every clone. That command, known as Clone Protocol 66, was built to make the clones turn on their own Jedi when the time finally came. Tup's broken chip had triggered it years ahead of schedule, and a Jedi had paid the price for a betrayal that was not even supposed to happen yet. Nobody could figure out what was wrong with him. The clone medic Kix examined Tup and came up with nothing at all. With no answers on hand, the decision was made to send Tup to Kamino. The Kaminoans were the only ones in the galaxy with the deep expertise needed to look inside a clone's brain and understand what had gone wrong. This terrified the men at the top of the conspiracy. Dooku and Sidious immediately feared that Tup might accidentally lead the Jedi straight to their secret. The Separatists were so worried that they even tried to snatch Tup while he was being transported. But the Republic held on to him and delivered him safely to Kamino, never realizing they were handing him to the very people most desperate to keep him quiet. Tup did not make the trip alone. His close friend, the ARC Trooper Fives, came with him to Tipoca City. Shaak Ti told Fives to stay on Kamino while the Kaminoans looked into what had caused Tup's breakdown. Fives agreed, but he was already uneasy about the whole thing, and that unease would soon grow into something much bigger. Behind closed doors, the Kaminoans were not searching for the truth. They already knew it. Chief Medical Scientist Nala Se and Prime Minister Lama Su quietly reported to Count Dooku what had really happened. Tup's chip had activated Protocol 66 far too early. This was the worst possible outcome, because it meant the secret was now sitting inside a living clone for anyone skilled enough to find. Dooku gave the Kaminoans clear and direct instructions. They were to do away with Tup, examine his body afterward, and hand the chip straight to Dooku himself. That way, the evidence of the conspiracy would never leave their control. The Kaminoans, reporting directly to a Sith Lord, agreed without a moment of hesitation. Nala Se set to work. She moved to quietly finish what Dooku had ordered, hidden behind the excuse of a routine medical study. But Fives was watching, and he was growing more suspicious of the Kaminoans by the minute. Something about their behavior did not sit right with him, so he decided to look into Tup's condition on his own. To do that, Fives turned to a medical droid called AZI-3. He convinced the droid that saving a patient mattered more than following any other order it had been given. With AZI-3 on his side, Fives had the droid run a deep scan of Tup's brain, and the scan found something. There was a strange object buried in there, an object the Kaminoans waved off as nothing more than a tumor. AZI-3 removed the object from Tup's head. For a brief moment, Tup woke up. He was awake just long enough to speak a few quiet words, saying that a mission and a string of nightmares were finally over. Then he slipped away. His final words made no sense to Fives at the time, but they would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Fives kept digging, and what he figured out was staggering. That so-called tumor was not a growth of any kind. It was an inhibitor chip, an organic device that did not belong to Jango's genome at all. Someone had placed it there on purpose, and worst of all, Fives realized that an identical chip was sitting inside every single clone in the entire army, including his own head. So Fives had AZI-3 find and remove his own chip too. When they compared the two, the picture became clear. Tup's chip had worn out and malfunctioned, while the chips themselves were standard issue, built into every clone the Kaminoans had ever produced. This was not a one-time defect. It was a feature of the whole army. The Kaminoans moved fast to bury the discovery. Nala Se rejected what AZI-3 had found and insisted the object was just a virus. The Kaminoan leadership pushed hard to shut the whole thing down and protect the secret of Protocol 66. They were not interested in the truth. They were interested in keeping it hidden. Fives was not done, though. The chip he had recovered was ordered sent off to a Republic medical facility for analysis. But Fives and AZI-3 secretly swapped the sample out, keeping the real evidence away from the people who wanted to make it disappear. For a moment, the truth was still alive, carried by one determined soldier. Then Fives was brought before Palpatine himself. And in a chilling twist, the Chancellor, who was secretly the architect of this entire scheme, actually acknowledged the chips to Fives directly. But before Fives could do anything with that, Palpatine flipped the whole situation around. He framed the trooper, making it look as though Fives had tried to harm him. From there, things fell apart for Fives quickly. He was drugged until he was paranoid and barely able to think straight, and he was branded a dangerous rogue. He fled across Coruscant, frantic and hunted, desperate to reach Anakin Skywalker and Captain Rex. He needed to warn them that this conspiracy reached all the way to the very top of the Republic. He was right about everything, and almost no one would listen. In the end, Fives was struck down by Commander Fox of the Coruscant Guard. He slipped away in the arms of Captain Rex, still insisting right up to the very end that the chips were real and that the danger was far bigger than anyone understood. He believed even then that he had failed to make anyone see it. The cover story that replaced the truth was a simple lie. The official explanation said that Tup and Fives had been infected by a rare parasite from Ringo Vinda. The Jedi accepted this, and they concluded that the chips helped keep the clones mentally stable. The real purpose of the chips stayed buried, exactly as the Sith wanted. Dooku and the Kaminoans had managed to silence both clones who stumbled onto the truth. Nala Se's cover-up did its job. It directly preserved the secret of Order 66, and in doing so, it helped seal the fate of the Jedi. The most important warning of the entire war had been quietly buried on a medical table on Kamino. Not everyone was fully convinced, though. Captain Rex could not quite shake what Fives had told him. He quietly filed a confidential report raising concerns about the chips and their possible hidden purpose, even though he knew it would probably be ignored. He could not prove anything yet, but the doubt had taken root. There was also the medic Kix, who later managed to uncover even more on his own. Kix learned the true function of the chips, and he even discovered that Palpatine was a Sith. But before he could expose any of it, he was captured and frozen in stasis, locked away where his knowledge could do no damage to the plan. This whole affair was the Kaminoans' darkest test, and they failed it completely. They were handed a chance to reveal a galaxy-shaking truth, one that could have saved countless lives and the entire Jedi Order. And they chose to bury it instead. In that moment, they stopped being innocent contractors. They became knowing guardians of the most dangerous weapon the Sith had ever built. The episode also exposed just how deeply the Kaminoans had tied themselves to the conspiracy's hidden masters. They reported directly to Dooku, a Sith Lord, and they valued the secret of Protocol 66 far above the lives of the very soldiers they had created. Their cold detachment had finally curdled into something much worse than simple indifference. There was one more lesson hidden in what happened to Tup and Fives. Their fate revealed a dangerous fragility in the chips themselves. A damaged chip could rot from the inside and cost a clone his life. That meant a quiet hazard was riding around inside every trooper in the Grand Army. A flaw that nobody outside the conspiracy even knew to look for. The immediate crisis was contained, and the secret held. But it was not contained completely. The seeds of doubt that Fives had planted in Captain Rex did not vanish with him. Down the line, those seeds would help a small handful of clones finally understand the control that had been built into them and begin to resist it. Everything had been building toward this one single moment. The Kaminoans had spent a full decade growing the most obedient army the galaxy had ever seen, never once grasping that they had also built the trigger for its greatest tragedy. At the climax of the Clone Wars, the hidden purpose that had been engineered into every clone on Kamino was finally set loose. The thing the Kaminoans had proudly called their finest work was about to become the instrument of a galaxy-wide disaster, and it would all happen at the press of a single command. That command came from Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, who had been secretly Darth Sidious the entire time. He issued Order 66, a secret directive sent out to clone troopers across the galaxy all at once. The Order branded the Jedi as traitors to the Republic, enemies who were to be dealt with the very moment they were seen. After a decade of patience, the Sith were finally ready to spring their trap. The instant the Order went out, the inhibitor chips did exactly what they had been built to do. Across countless battlefields, in nearly the same heartbeat, the chips inside the clones activated. They overrode the soldiers' conscience and their loyalty all at once, and they compelled the clones to turn on their own Jedi commanders. There was no warning and no chance to react. The cruelty of this is hard to overstate. These were clones who had fought beside their Jedi generals for years, who had fought and bonded with them on 100 different worlds. And in a single heartbeat, those same soldiers turned on them without hesitation. Any clone who somehow managed to resist the order put himself at terrible risk, because he might be branded a traitor right alongside the Jedi. In a matter of just a few hours, the chips engineered on Kamino did something no enemy army had ever come close to doing. They brought about the near-total collapse of the Jedi Order across the entire galaxy. A group of Guardians who had protected the Republic for ages was undone, not by a stronger force, but by the very soldiers they had been leading into battle. And the chips worked exactly the way the Sith had always intended. When Sidious and his apprentice reworked Sifo-Dyas' original safeguard, this was the outcome they had been planning for all along. The Kaminoans' mastery of engineered obedience, the thing they were so proud of, had just delivered the Jedi straight into Palpatine's waiting hands. Their craftsmanship had done precisely what it had been secretly designed to do. With the Jedi all but gone, Palpatine made his final move. He reorganized the Galactic Republic into the First Galactic Empire, and he declared himself Emperor. In doing so, he brought an end to 1,000 generations of Jedi watching over the galaxy. The Republic was finished, and a dictatorship rose up in its place. The clone troopers, the sons of Kamino, became the first stormtroopers of this new imperial order. The faces the Kaminoans had grown, and the obedience they had built into those faces, were now serving the very dictatorship that their creation had made possible. The army built for the Republic had become the army of the Empire overnight. Step back, and the scale of what the Kaminoans had done becomes clear. Partly knowing and partly unaware, they had manufactured the hinge on which the entire galaxy swung from Republic to Empire. Without the clones, and without the chips hidden inside them, none of this could have happened. Kamino sat at the very center of the largest power shift in galactic history. For one brief moment, it looked like Kamino's importance was secure. After all, the new empire had been built on the backs of the clones, which meant it still needed the clones, and therefore still needed the world that grew them. The Kaminoans could be forgiven for thinking their place in the galaxy was safe, but the truth was the exact opposite, and it arrived fast. The rise of the Empire instantly changed the math for Kamino. The Sith's great project was now complete. They had their empire, and the moment that happened, the whole reason for keeping an expensive, independent clone army around began to fade away. Kamino's value had always been tied to a need that suddenly no longer existed. The new regime wasted no time at all. It moved quickly to secure Kamino and all of its cloning technology, clamping firm imperial control over the planet that had served as the Republic's arsenal for so long. The Empire understood something important about this place. Whoever controlled Kamino's cloning expertise controlled a power that could one day be turned against the Emperor himself. That made it a power to be either shut down or kept entirely under their own control. For the Kaminoans, the change in tone was jarring. Their leaders had spent years being courted and flattered as valued partners. Now they suddenly found themselves answering to grim imperial officers who treated them as subjects. The polite negotiations were over. Cold orders had taken their place. The clones who lived through the war carried their chips and their conditioning straight into imperial service. But even as they marched under the new banner, the regime was already quietly making plans to replace them. The soldiers did not know it, but their days were numbered the moment the Empire was born. The pride the Kaminoans had always taken in their soldiers now turned into a serious problem for them. The Empire looked at this army and did not like what it saw. Here was a force that had been created for the Republic, an army that had served under Jedi command for years. To the new regime, that history made the clones an awkward reminder of the old order, an ideological problem that needed solving. The unease ran right to the top. Imperial commanders, with Moff Wilhuff Tarkin chief among them, were deeply troubled by the independence the clones had shown throughout the war. That spark of creativity and free thinking, the very thing the Kaminoans had carefully bred into them to make them better fighters, now looked like a danger. A soldier who could think for himself was exactly what a tyrant did not want around. Here is the bitter heart of it. The clones had carried out Order 66 perfectly, exactly as designed. And that flawless success is precisely what made them expendable. Their one great purpose had been fulfilled. With that done, both the soldiers and the people who made them were already being quietly measured for the scrap heap. In the space of a single command, Kamino's fortunes flipped completely. The planet went from being the indispensable heart of the Republic's war machine to a costly leftover from a war the new empire would rather forget entirely. Everything that had made Kamino essential vanished the instant the war ended. There is a deep irony sitting at the center of all of this. The Kaminoans were masters of foresight when it came to genetics. They could predict and shape the future of a living thing down to the smallest detail. And yet they completely failed to see their own future coming. The customer they had served so faithfully had no further use for them, and they never saw it until it was already too late. Order 66 was the Kaminoans' ultimate product, the highest expression of their craft. It was also the thing that sealed their own fate. The weapon they had perfected brought one era of the galaxy to a close, and in the very same motion, it brought an end to their own age right along with it. They had built the very thing that would one day be used to bring them down. With the Empire victorious, the Jedi were all but gone, and the clone homeworld was left standing exposed to the cold gratitude of the regime it had helped create. What came next was not a sudden attack. It was something slower and far more deliberate, the careful taking apart of everything the Kaminoans had built, and in the end, of the Kaminoans themselves. They had armed the future, and now that future was turning around to erase them from it. It is worth being clear about one thing here. The clones' obedience in that terrible moment was not a question of their character or their choices. It was a matter of biology. The chips overrode everything, even the deep bonds that so many troopers had formed with their Jedi commanders. These men did not betray the Jedi because they wanted to. They were forced to by a device they never even knew was there. There were a rare few exceptions. A small number of clones whose chips had been damaged or removed managed to keep their free will when the order came. So did certain unusual units, like the group known as Clone Force 99. These were the handful who stayed themselves while the rest of the army fell under the command of a single word. For the Kaminoans, the perfect execution of Order 66 was, in a grim way, the ultimate proof that their work had succeeded. Their engineered obedience had performed without a single flaw, exactly as designed, and it had done so on a scale that spanned the entire galaxy. It was the greatest demonstration of their skill they could ever have asked for, and it was also the beginning of their end. The whole shift from Republic to Empire happened so quickly that Kamino barely had time to process what its creations had just done. There was no time to reckon with it and no time to weigh the consequences. Before the dust had even settled, the new regime was already on its way to seize control of the planet, and the long, quiet undoing of Kamino had begun. The Kaminoans had just handed the new empire the greatest gift it could ever receive: a finished army and a fallen enemy. Their reward for all of it was to be quietly thrown away. It started almost as soon as the empire was born. Imperial leadership began openly asking a simple, cold question. Was it really worth the cost to keep cloning soldiers on Kamino at all? The moment that question was on the table, the long slide toward the Kaminoans' downfall had already begun. The Empire decided the answer was no. It moved to cancel its long-standing contracts with the Kaminoan government, and the official reason given was money. The argument was straightforward. The galaxy was now full of ordinary beings who could be drafted into service, an almost endless supply of recruits, and that was far cheaper than growing soldiers one at a time on a distant ocean world. But the cost was never the only reason. There was a deeper discomfort at work underneath it. This was an army that had been made for the Republic and had spent years serving under the Jedi. To the leaders of the new empire, that history made the clones an awkward fit, a living reminder of the very thing the Empire had just replaced. They did not want the old world soldiers to be the lasting face of their new order. Tarkin felt this more strongly than most. He personally objected to just how much independence the clones had shown over the course of the war. He did not trust soldiers who could think for themselves. What he wanted instead were recruits who would follow orders without question, men with no real will of their own. To a man like Tarkin, a soldier who asked questions was a problem waiting to happen. So the Empire set out to replace the clones entirely. It launched something called Project War Mantle, run by Vice Admiral Edmund Rampart under Tarkin's authority. Rampart was a cold and ambitious officer, and his job was to build a brand new army made up of ordinary recruits. The plan even had a use for the old soldiers in the short term. Rampart suggested using a handful of veteran clones as instructors to train the first waves of these new enlisted troopers. Once that training was finished, the clones themselves would be quietly set aside. The Kaminoans could feel what was coming, and they panicked. Sensing that their whole way of life was suddenly in danger, Lama Su and the rest of the Kaminoan leadership scrambled to prove they were still worth keeping around. They needed to show the Empire that Kamino still had something it could not get anywhere else. Lama Su landed on an idea. He reasoned that Kamino's only future lay in offering the Empire a new and better kind of clone. This was actually a real problem the Kaminoans were facing, because Jango Fett's original genetic code had kept breaking down in the years since he was gone. The DNA they had been copying for so long was wearing thin, and the quality kept slipping. If they wanted to impress the Empire, they needed fresh, perfect genetic material to work with. That need pulled their attention toward their rarest treasures. Scattered among all the engineered soldiers were a tiny number of unaltered first-generation clones, the ones who carried pure, undamaged Fett DNA. These were the keys to everything the Kaminoans were now hoping to do. The most important of them was the young clone Omega. Unlike the millions of soldiers, Omega was a pure copy of Jango, the same way Boba was, with none of the engineering done to the rank and file. Her genome was clean and untouched, which made her one of the most valuable beings on the entire planet to anyone who wanted to push cloning even further. The girl who had been living a quiet life on Kamino was suddenly a prize. Around this same time, another remarkable group came out of Kamino. This was Clone Force 99, better known as the Bad Batch. They were a squad of clones whose genetics had come out defective and enhanced in unusual ways, and those very mutations had an enormous side effect. When Order 66 fired across the galaxy, most of the Bad Batch were not affected by it. Their strange genetics meant their chips never took full control, so they kept their own free will. The only one of them who eventually fell under the chip's influence was their sharpshooter Crosshair, and even that only happened later, after the Empire tampered with him directly. Because they were free of the control the rest of the army was under, the Bad Batch quickly found themselves on the outs with the new Empire. They did not fit into a regime that demanded total obedience. In the end, they made the choice to flee Kamino altogether, and when they ran, they took young Omega with them, getting her out from under Imperial reach. The Kaminoan leadership was not willing to let her go so easily. In their desperate effort to win the Empire's favor, Lama Su and Taun We actually schemed to grab Omega and hand her over to Imperial scientists. To them, this child was not a person at all. She was a genetic resource, a bargaining chip they could trade to prove Kamino's worth. It was the old Kaminoan coldness showing through at the worst possible moment. Their plan was to deliver Omega through a meeting that involved the bounty hunter Cad Bane. But it fell apart. And the reason it fell apart says something genuinely surprising about one of the Kaminoans. Nala Se had secretly hired a mercenary named Fennec Shand to protect the girl behind everyone's back. That detail is worth sitting with for a second. Nala Se was the same scientist who had spent her whole career insisting that clones were nothing but property, the same woman who had helped bury the truth about the chips. And yet, somewhere along the way, she had formed a real attachment to Omega. For just a moment, a genuine crack appeared in that famous Kaminoan detachment. Even Nala Se, it turned out, could come to care about one of her own creations. While all of this was happening, the Empire kept stripping Kamino down to the bone. As the decommissioning rolled forward, the regime took everything it considered valuable. It pulled out the clone troopers and the cadets, seized the embryos and the stores of genetic material, and claimed any Kaminoan it deemed useful, including Nala Se herself. Piece by piece, the planet was being emptied out. Far away on Coruscant, the Senator Halle Burtoni had started to sense the betrayal coming. She grew suspicious that the Empire fully intended to turn on her people, and while digging into it, she discovered that Rampart was quietly diverting Senate funds that had been set aside for Kamino into other programs entirely. The money meant for her world was being spent somewhere else. Burtoni's snooping did not save anyone. Instead, it cost her everything. She lost her seat in the Imperial Senate for becoming too nosy and too inconvenient, and her warnings about what was about to happen to Kamino fell on deaf ears. The one voice trying to speak up for the Kaminoans was removed from the room. Lama Su did not fare any better. Having outlived his usefulness to the Empire, and having dared to formally protest the loss of the contracts, he was branded a traitor. The Empire had him arrested and detained on Coruscant. The proud leader who had once treated this entire project as the single greatest contract of his life was now a prisoner of the very power he had helped put in charge. And here is the cruelest part of the entire story. The Kaminoans had spent generations treating millions of clones as property, as things to be used and discarded whenever it suited them. Now those very same Kaminoans were being treated as expendable assets themselves, cast aside by the regime their own work had created. Everything they had done to others was now being done to them in turn. Their frantic clawing to stay useful did not help them at all. If anything, it only sped up their downfall. The Empire calmly took whatever it wanted from Kamino and got ready to throw the rest away. The clones had been reassigned, the important personnel had been secured, and the leadership had been locked up. With all of that done, the Empire turned its attention to one final, cold plan for the world it no longer had any need for. The escape of the Bad Batch had said something the Empire would not forget. Their defection proved that even engineered soldiers could slip the leash when their genetics or their conscience allowed it. It was a living example of the exact independence that had made the Empire so nervous about these soldiers in the first place. As for Omega, her pure first-generation genome left her caught between two fates. She was the Kaminoans' best hope for staying relevant, and at the very same time, she was a prize the Empire badly wanted for itself as it tried to perfect cloning beyond the worn-out Fett line. A single child had somehow become the most fought-over genetic sample in the entire galaxy. And then there was Taunwi. Once, she had been the gracious and welcoming face of Kamino, the official who greeted visitors with calm courtesy. By the end, she had been reduced to a desperate functionary, scheming to trade away a child just to win a small scrap of favor from the Empire. There was no better measure of how far the Kaminoans had fallen than that. When the Empire had finished taking everything it wanted from Kamino, there was only one thing left to do. It needed to make the world that knew its deepest secret disappear for good. This was around 19 BBY. With every useful asset already stripped from the planet, the Empire moved to erase Kamino entirely. The plan was to bring down Tipoca City and shut the cloning facilities down forever, leaving nothing of value behind. Vice Admiral Edmond Rampart oversaw the whole operation, acting on the orders of Moff Wilhuff Tarkin. The job had two parts. First, pull out the last of the clones, the scientists, and the cloning technology worth keeping. Then bring down everything that remained. And Rampart added a layer of deliberate cruelty to it. He used clone troopers to carry out the bombardment, the very soldiers who had been born in Tipoca City. He forced the clones to bring down their own birthplace, to fire on the one place that had ever come close to being a home for them. It was a coldness that fit the regime perfectly. Rampart's Star Destroyers opened fire on Tipoca City and the other cities of Kamino from high above. The great stilted towers that the Kaminoans had spent generations raising above the waves began to collapse. One by one, the cloning facilities broke apart and sank down into the planet's endless seas. The work of 19,000 years was coming apart in a single night. A clone officer reported back to Rampart, and you could hear how shaken he was. He told Rampart that the cities had been brought down and that every Kaminoan facility had been lost to the ocean. By the time the sun came up the next morning, only a few thin columns of smoke marked the spot where the grand towers of Tipoca City had once stood. The Kaminoan people themselves did not all escape. Many of them had been rounded up and forced off the planet ahead of the attack. Others were caught in the bombardment and did not survive it. Out of an entire species, only a small number of survivors were left, scattered across the stars with no home to return to. Then the Empire told the galaxy a lie. Imperial officials, Rampart among them, claimed that a massive, catastrophic storm had torn through Kamino, devastating its facilities and nearly bringing the Kaminoan people to an end. They called it a natural disaster, with nobody to blame. The truth was something else entirely. The storm story was a complete fabrication, a staged disaster meant to hide what had really happened. The Empire had seized Kamino's cloning secrets for itself and quietly carried on the work in the shadows. Blaming a storm kept the public from ever asking the right questions. Not everyone went down with the city. The Bad Batch and Crosshair barely made it out of the collapsing world alive. They survived a desperate journey through Kamino's flooded tunnels, using medical capsules taken from Nala Se's lab as makeshift floats to keep their heads above the rising water. They escaped, but only just. The lie did not hold forever either. Later on, a senator named Rio Chuchi worked to drag the truth into the light. She was helped by a reluctant Halle Burtoni and by Omega, and together they uncovered footage of Rampart's bombardment, along with proof that he had been diverting funds meant for Kamino. The evidence was damning. Cornered, Palpatine threw Rampart under the bus. The Emperor publicly disavowed him, ordered his arrest, and painted him as a rogue officer acting entirely on his own. But Palpatine was not about to waste a good crisis. He turned right around and used the destruction of Kamino to push something called the Imperial Defense Recruitment Bill through the Senate, expanding his own power even further off the back of the very tragedy he had ordered. That left one Kaminoan still standing at the center of the story. Nala Se was considered too valuable to discard, so Rampart secured her and shipped her off-world. She was the last prominent Kaminoan from Tipoca City to survive, and she was kept alive for one reason only. The Empire wanted her cloning expertise. She was taken to a hidden Imperial facility at a place called Mount Tantis on the planet Wayland. In legend, this was the same world that held Palpatine's secret cloning storehouse and his Sparti cylinders. It was the perfect place to hide the Empire's darkest scientific work. There, Nala Se was forced into the most secret research program the Empire had, an effort called Project Necromancer. The work focused on advanced cloning, extending life, and copying those who were sensitive to the Force. It was science pushed to its furthest and most disturbing edge, and it all served one enormous goal. Project Necromancer existed to feed Palpatine's ultimate ambition, his desire to build himself a cloned body that could hold his essence and bring him back after he was gone. This was the very seed of the return that would one day take root on a distant world called Exegol. Nala Se wanted no part of it. Furious over what had been done to her people and her world, she refused to cooperate. And for that, she was imprisoned at Tantis for months. She stayed defiant the entire time, even under pressure from a sinister figure named Dr. Royce Hemlock. Hemlock needed a way to break her, and he found one. He had the imprisoned former Prime Minister Lama Su brought to Wayland and questioned. In exchange for a promise of his freedom, Lama Su gave Hemlock the one piece of leverage that actually mattered. He revealed that Nala Se had grown attached to Omega. Hemlock acted on it immediately. He captured Omega and used the young clone as a hostage, forcing Nala Se to finally work on Project Necromancer by holding the threat of harm to Omega over her head. The one soft spot Nala Se had was now being turned into a weapon against her. As for Lama Su, he was never heard from again after giving up that information. He was almost certainly silenced for good to protect the Empire's secrets, a quiet and shameful end for the last Prime Minister that Kamino would ever have. The man who once led the entire planet vanished without a trace. The story reached its peak in the project's final hours. The Bad Batch stormed Mount Tantis and freed the prisoners being held there. In the chaos, Nala Se broke away on her own, determined to destroy her own research and make sure the Empire could never use it to bring Palpatine back. Rampart chased her into her lab, hoping to grab the data for himself and use it to save his own skin. But Nala Se had already made her choice. She armed a thermal detonator. When Rampart fired on her, the detonator went off, and the blast brought the whole lab down around them. Neither of them made it out. Her final act did exactly what she wanted it to do. The explosion destroyed the central databanks of Project Necromancer. Tarkin later confirmed that nothing could be recovered from the wreckage, and the funding that had gone into the project was redirected toward a new one, Project Stardust, which would go on to become the first Death Star. In the end, the last great Kaminoan scientist had set Palpatine's resurrection back by years. Because of what she did, the Empire could not clone its emperor before the Galactic Civil War, and the work she destroyed would only rise again much later, in a hidden corner of the galaxy called Exegol.